folks, welcome back to another lesson of It's Not Rocket Science when it comes to horse and hoof care with me, Lindsay Setchell. And in this lesson we're going to talk about a subject that lots of people have questions about, and that is the subject of flare. Horses having flare in their hooves, is it okay? Is it something to worry about? Is it something that we should trim away? Should we be doing that regularly on every single trim? Should we speed up the trims? Should we do them every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks instead of every 6 so that we can keep on top of flare? What should we do about flare? Well, firstly, we need to understand what flare is. And there are 3 types of flare, and that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. There are 3 types. There is unnatural flare, what we call unnatural flare. There is natural flare, and then we have laminitic flare. So these are 3 types of flare, and your horse can have all 3, 1, 2 or none. It just depends, and we're going to go through that in this lesson. So without further ado, let's get rid of the rockets. Alright, so let's start by looking at unnatural flare. Unnatural, what we call unnatural flare. So imagine we're looking at the front of the horse's foot and we're looking at the front of the leg there, and then here's the hoof and it has a bit of flare like this. On this side here we can see a little bit of flare. Now we're looking at it from the top and we're going, oh, there seems to be some flare in that horse's foot, but we can't tell what that flare is until we look underneath, and then we can get a better idea. So let's look at this foot underneath now. So it's going out slightly there, and what we've got is we've got some flare on this side. So with unnatural flare, you have the hoof wall that comes all the way around. I'm sorry, it's a bit wobbly. And it comes all the way around, and then when it gets to here, this is the shape of the foot. You can still see the shape of the foot is pretty good, but over here we have a very thick hoof wall. So this part here is very thick. So what I've just drawn in there is the white line. So this part here is the white line. So we've just drawn that in. That's the black line. Now I'm going to attempt to draw in the inner hoof and the outer hoof wall. So I'm going to put a little blue dotted line all the way around this foot. And then when we get to here, you can still see that it's following pretty much the same thickness all the way around. But we've still got this area here that is overly thick. And this is what we call unnatural flare. Now the way that you deal with that is through the trim, because what we want is a balanced foot. We want the horse to have balance throughout the mass of the horse's foot. And when there's too much flare on this side of unnatural flare, meaning there's a lot of hoof wall, that means that on this side of the foot there's going to be a lot more mass than there is on this side of the foot, and that is going to affect the way that that foot moves through the air and the way that that foot is placed on the ground. So this needs to be addressed in the trim, and that's really easy to do because we're trying to keep the hoof wall pretty much the same thickness all the way around. So in the trim we would be interested in doing this. There you go. And so this part here, this part of the flare that was an extra thickness in the hoof wall, has now gone. We've removed it and it's gone. But you can't just chop it off and forget about it. You also therefore need to address that extra mass and that extra thickness on the top side of the hoof here. Now this is really important in the trim, and that's not what I'm going to teach you here right now, but what's really important is that you don't just chop it off here, guess, come back over here and do a load of rasping to sort of rasp that straight, because you don't know how close you're getting into the inner hoof wall when you do that. And if you go too close into the inner hoof wall, you're going to end up getting to the white line. Now this is the biggest problem that we see when we see people trimming and trying to tame flare, because they try and do it all from the top, which means they're working blind effectively because they can't see how close they're getting to that white line. And the last thing we want to do is remove this mass here. We want the extra mass, this mass that's on the outside here, that's extra thick. We want to remove that, but we don't want to remove this inner part here. And so the way that you do that is a very particular way. When you trim, you don't trim to a 45 degree, you trim to a 90 degree first, and then you address the outside of the foot, and then you bring the foot back, and then you carry on as if you were doing it normally, doing your 45 degree Mustang roll trim. And that's how you deal with this kind of flare. Is it a problem? No. Do you need to keep coming back every 3 or 4 weeks to tame it? No. But this is just something that is happening with this horse. It's just producing more mass on one side of the foot. And gradually over time, with this kind of flare, the more that horse moves, the more that you allow it to have the right kind of diet and the right kind of management, and it's in with others of its own species and it's marching around, the foot does start to sort itself out eventually, and it will start to become more balanced through the mass through the foot. But it all depends on that diet and management, and of course the health of this foot. So that's unnatural. So now let's have a look at natural flare. So it could present itself looking pretty much the same from the outside. We have this bit of flare here. So it looks a bit similar to the unnatural flare out from the top, but we can't tell until we look at it underneath. So we've got the flare coming out, all right, but with this one, look, there is no change with the thickness of the hoof wall. The thickness of the hoof wall is pretty much the same all the way around. And if we put in our division between the inner and the outer hoof wall, and we go around like this, you can see that in fact all the wall is pretty much the same all the way around, but what we have is an even thickness thereabouts. But we have this deviation. So what should we do about that? Well, that horse has put that deviation there because of the way that horse walks. So that horse has put that there because it needs it. And the last thing that we should do is remove it. So you'll hear farriers talking about putting lateral extensions on a horse, or sometimes even medial extensions, or they don't tend to use those as often, but certainly lateral extensions. Well, that's kind of what the horse is doing here. And you see this kind of shape on a hind foot. So this would be, for instance, a right hind foot. And you would see this kind of shape on a hind foot, particularly. You see it on front feet, you see it on all kinds of feet. Now, the reason that horse is putting that flare there is because that these feet, the hooves, respond to the gait, and the gait is determined by the biomechanics of the horse further up. As long as you are trimming naturally to the horse's constants, which in this instance, of course, is the hard sole plane when we're talking about horses and their natural parameters in their foot. If what you're doing is not that, and you're trying to tame this flare, or you're trying to chop the flare away or rasp it away to make it look nice, neat and tidy, all you're doing is putting that horse's hoof into a situation where it doesn't want to be, because it is trying to do this because it is responding to the way that horse is walking. And particularly horses that we take barefoot, that we take out of shoes, you will suddenly see them put out these weird flares. They'll put them out laterally, they'll put them out medially, and they look crazy. And compared to what the feet look like in a shoe to the owner that's new to barefoot, they sometimes think, my goodness, this horse is suddenly, it's all going wrong, the horse is putting flares out here, and they start to get really worried about it, and they want their trimmer to come back more and more often to start trimming that flare away. And truly, you shouldn't be doing that. You should just be looking at the foot and going, okay, what kind of flare is this? Well, this is natural flare because the horse is putting it there. When it was trussed up in a shoe and it was being modelled to look more like a more symmetrical foot, so don't be worried about it when your horses go barefoot and suddenly they start kicking out flares all over the place. You shouldn't worry about that. It is, of course, the horse responding to their body and what's going on above the hoof. They've been in shoes for a long time. They've not been able to shape the foot that they need for their body, and their body will change the longer they stay barefoot, of course, and the more that they're put on a natural lifestyle, and so the feet just start to change. And sometimes when we take shoes off horses and we say, okay, your horse is probably going to need some boots, your horse may not fit in those boots for that long because their feet are changing. So it's important that we don't just see this as an unsightly flare that just needs lopping off and removing, because the horse has put it there, and it put it there for a reason. And the reason we know that is because this hoof wall has not changed in thickness. Unlike with unnatural flare, where we had extra mass on one side, that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is it's staying the same thickness all the way around, but we've got some deviation in the hoof wall. So how do we trim it? We trim it just the same as we would with the rest of the foot. Everything comes down to the hard sole plane, and you put that 45-degree angle in on the Mustang roll because that's what the horse would naturally do. And if you are trimming that wall down to the hard sole plane, you have to put back what the horse had there in the first place. You can't just leave it totally without a roll, because that's not how the horse would have it. So you put that roll back in, being very careful not to come into the inner hoof wall, and then you leave that as it is. And then when you come to dress the front of the foot, if you're giving the front of the foot a little bit of a scuff, the last thing that you should do is try and remove this, because you will go straight into the waterline, and in some instances right up to the sole. You don't do that. You don't over trim the outside of the foot. You can't do that. Unlike with the unnatural flare where we were removing mass, this one you can't do that because it's actually meant to be there, because the hoof wall isn't extra thick. So if you were to rasp away, you could very, very quickly go through that wall. So we don't do that. Okay, so that's unnatural and natural. So we've done those, unnatural and natural. Now we're going to look at laminitic flare. And like I said, your horse could be, I'm not going to say suffering because it isn't suffering, but your horse could be exhibiting all of these flares, or one of these flares, or two of these flares in different feet too. So let's now have a look at the laminitic flare. Okay, and I might redraw that actually. A laminitic foot will often take this very typical shape, which we call a bell-bottom shape. And depending on whether they've had acute attacks or they've just been chronic for a long time, again, will depend on how much stretch there is. But that is a very typical shape that we see in horses that have laminitic flare. So this isn't the same as the unnatural or the natural. This is where the horse has got laminitis. Now this foot is going to look a little bit more elongated as we come around. Now you can see, let's put those bars back in. Now you can see with this one, you've got an awful lot of distance between the tip, the apex of the frog, and the outer hoof wall. Now that should first of all start to show you that there's something going wrong here, because the foot tends to work in thirds, okay? And therefore the hoof wall should actually be finishing around about here, okay? But it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because this has got some stretch in it. So let's have a look at the hoof wall itself. So let's draw in the hoof wall. So there it is. Here's the hoof wall. I do apologise about my wobbly lines. Okay. There you go, all the way around. And what we can see here now is that all this here, and it can go all the way back, is what we call stretch, or the lamella wedge. So it can go all the way back here, and that's the lamella wedge. This is where the horse has been suffering from laminitis, where the white line is no longer nice and tight, anything up to about 2 mils. The white line should be any more than that, and you're getting stretch. And this is quite a severe amount of stretch, but horses can have a varied amount of stretch. And that stretch is where the epidermal lamina and the dermal lamina that are meant to be interlocked together have now started to stretch. And that is now seen on the ground level where we see this laminar wedge. If you want me to talk about stretch and laminitis, what actually happens to those laminae, then just let me know in the comments below and I'll attempt to do an It's Not Rocket Science lesson on that. But getting back to this and getting back to the flare, If we look again, and I do apologise, like I said, about my terrible wobbly lines, but here we have the hoof wall, and we've got the inner and the outer hoof wall, and that should be carrying on all the way down there. But then we have this stretch. Now, when we come and treat a foot like this, because we know a lot about biology and we know a lot about feedback mechanisms and how the hoof grows and growth rates and the papillae that are up in the coronary band that need that feedback, because of all of that, we see a foot like this and we go, okay, so we've got stretch there. What are we going to do about that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk to the owner, and we're going to change that diet and the management, because it's the diet that's caused this. It started off in the gut, and it was a cascading chain of events that caused it to get to this stage in the foot. It's happening all over the body, but we tend to see it in the foot first, and they call it laminitis, and before you know it, everybody thinks it's just the foot. It isn't. It's this whole body problem, but it starts in the gut. So we've got this separation, so therefore it's giving this look from the outside, this bell-bottom shape from the outside, and you have this long toe. So our aim now is to get the owner to change the diet and the management so that we can rehab this horse, so that gradually over time that wedge will shrink back. And it's amazing when that happens, and I think if you followed HM for long enough, you'll have seen quite a few of those rehabs and how we do that. But in this instance, how do we deal with it? How do we trim it? Well, we just put our 45-degree Mustang roll in, and we keep this toe in place. And that's really vitally important, because the problem is when people see this kind of flare, this laminitic flare, in fact, when they see unnatural and natural flare, they just want to jump on top of it and make that foot look normal. You can't do that. There are consequences to those actions to the foot, and you don't want to put your horse into further trauma and further problems by trying to make it look nice and neat. But what you do see is you see an awful lot of this, where all of this will be removed, and then they try to make it look better from the outside, and so by doing that, in actual fact, they end up trimming a great deal of the wall away. And then when you look at the foot from the front, even when it's on the ground, you can then see that big wedge, because they've rasped back that wall trying to get that HPA. So here you have the horse's foot, here you have the pastern, here you have the coronary band, and what they're trying to do is get this in line, and by doing that they have to rasp and rasp and rasp and rasp, because it was out here. They rasp all this away, and then you're left with this situation here, where you've exposed all the epidermal lamina, because that's what you can see. So you shouldn't do that, and because if you do this, now what you're going to have is a horse that's trying to put out a great big thick callus here, because just here is the, if you extrapolate it back up, is the distal edge of P3. And so now the horse has been put onto its sole, all that pressure is going all the way into the distal edge of P3, and that is a problem. So we don't treat laminitic flare like that. We treat it just like any other part of the hoof on the hoof wall, and we give it that ordinary 45-degree Mustang roll as you're going around, and then you let it be. Because if you do try and tame this, another thing happens too. Because as you chop all of this off, the owner who's looking at that horse's foot has no clue that their horse has that much stretch. And this happens all the time when we take horses that we are rehabbing and we see a foot that's had the toe removed, and we go, okay, actually that horse has got a lot of stretch, it's got a lot of laminitic stretch, you just can't see it, so therefore you don't realise how bad it is because it's all been removed. So apart from the fact that biology says don't remove it, it's a good idea for the owner to see how stretched that horse's foot is, so that they can go, oh right, okay, this is definitely, we've got laminitis here, raging laminitis, we need to sort this out. And gradually you see that shrink back. And the horse doesn't trip and the horse doesn't tear its lamina, because this shrinks back fine when you start that healing pathway and you give them all the right diet and management. So those are the three flares. We've got Unnatural flare, which is an extra thickness, an extra mass in the hoof wall. We've got natural flare, where the horse is putting that natural deviation in because of the way it's walking, and therefore you've got to be very careful how you trim that, and you mustn't rasp that from the top at all, because what's going to happen is you're going to go straight through that wall into the white line and into the sole very quickly. And there's no point in trying to tame it either, because the horse needs it, and as soon as you've done it, guess what's going to happen? It's going to pop back up again. And then we have the laminitic flare with that very typical bell-bottom shaped foot, which is trying to be tamed. They're trying to take too much hoof wall off, they're trying to take the wedge off, they're trying to make that foot look normal again, and by doing so putting the foot into more peril. So that's not what we do. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that quick lesson on flare and the 3 types of flare. If you'd like me to talk about anything else to do with horse and hoof care, put a comment below and I'll do my best. I'll see you again. Bye bye.